Hi, this is Dr. Stabio, and this is an overview of sensory systems that will help teach you the patterns that are common to all sensory systems. This will help you learn the special senses more efficiently. Sensation is fundamental to how we interact with the world, and it's different in all sorts of different animals in the animal kingdom. For example, smelling each other's butt is fundamental to how dogs interact with the world and socialize. Geese have a compass inside their brains that help them navigate the world by detecting the magnetic field of the earth. It's fundamental to how they navigate. Mantis shrimp, they have this incredible visual system that's like 1,000 times more sophisticated than ours. They have like 12 color options. They have ability to detect various polarizations of light, and they use that for, believe it or not, mating in sync with the cycles of the moon and the tides. It's incredible. Dolphins, they fundamentally interact with the world through echolocation. And humans, like this wonderful baby right here, who happens to be mine when he was a few months old, they interact with the world from the very first start through vision and smell and sound. So the question is, how does the nervous system sense and perceive stimuli? And I highlighted these in bold because these two terms are a little bit different. Sense is the process of detecting the information from the environment, and perception happens in the brain. All sensory systems have a general pattern of organization. They start with a sense organ and a receptor that detects the environmental stimulus. Oftentimes there's peripheral feedback, and that information, if it's somatosensation in the case of touch of the skin of the body, that will travel through a spinal nerve. If it's touch of the face or any of the special senses, it will go through a cranial nerve. In most cases, that will relay to a primary sensory nucleus, often in the brainstem. But before it gets there, that information, that receptive information about I just detected light or I just sensed something on my skin will go through a reflex center, either in the spinal cord or the brainstem. On its way to the brain, it oftentimes crosses the midline, and most sensory systems, except for smell, will go and relay to the thalamus. Then the information will be sent to the brain, to a primary sensory cortex. That could be primary visual cortex, primary somatosensory cortex, primary auditory cortex, primary gustatory cortex, and so on and so forth. That's the first order processing in the brain's cortex. Then the information goes to higher sensory cortices and association cortices, where the information is associated, say the visual information is associated with the sound information. All along this pathway, information is relayed to the limbic system to do emotional interpretation. In some cases, the limbic system will send an automatic response, like that visual image is a snake, that's frightening, you need to fight or flight. And that will go to the autonomic nervous system for a response through the hypothalamus. The information also goes to the hippocampus to form circuits and consolidate that sensory information for the formation of memory. The information will also go to the prefrontal cortex to make decisions and to plan for the future in response to that sensory stimuli. And that will create a planned response. Now, the hypothalamic autonomic response is very rapid. The planned response, it's a little bit slower. If you notice, there's an arrow between these two. So when you're a child, this arrow is not fully myelinated, these circuits. And so a lot of times the responses are autonomic. Tantrums, just a knee-jerk response based on the emotion of the moment. It takes time for us to develop our prefrontal cortex and say, you know what, I'm not going to punch that kid in the face for taking my toy. I'm going to process this and think about it rationally and maybe decide to share or talk about it. There's also a table that I find really useful for memorizing the special senses. It has the system here, and I've separated this somatosensation system for the face because the chart is devoted to cranial nerves. The receptor, and it's the sense organ, the receptor cell type, the cranial nerve nucleus, the subnucleus within the thalamus, and the primary sensory cortex. We'll fill this out throughout the week and provide the answers at the end of the week. So let's talk about properties that are common to all sensory systems. The first is reception and receptive fields. So reception is the process. So reception requires a receptor, and this is a specialized neuron that exists at the point at which the human body interacts with the environment for that sense. For the visual system, it's photoreceptors, specifically rods and cones, and not shown here are intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. For the vestibular and auditory system, they're hair cells. In the gustatory system, they're taste receptor cells. You can see multiples of these bundled together in a taste bud. In the olfactory system, the sense of smell, they're olfactory receptor cells that dangle down from the cribriform plate into the nasal cavity, detecting smell. And for the skin, there's all sorts of somatosensory receptors that are specialized for different functions, such as free nerve endings for detecting pain, temperature, Pacinian corpuscles for detecting vibration, Meissner's corpuscles for detecting light touch. But what do receptors do? Receptors are essentially energy transformers. I know some of you played with transformers as kids, and what do? They transform from one thing to another, a car to an amazing bumblebee. That's what receptors do in the sense organ. So in the case of the visual system, photoreceptors that line the back of the retina, they detect light in the form of photon energy, and they convert that to an electrochemical signal that ultimately results in action potentials in the optic nerve. The frequency of these action potentials is the code that the nervous system reads. It's the language of the nervous system. In the case of the auditory system and the vestibular system, it's mechanical energy, either in the form of a sound wave or in fluid moving around in the semicircular canals. That's transferred by hair cells into an electrochemical signal that ultimately results in an action potential in the vestibulocochlear nerve that sends a signal to the brain that interprets that environmental stimulus. In the olfactory and gustatory systems, taste and smell, it's chemical energy. The chemicals that are emitted by something, food or a flower, gets detected by olfactory receptor cells in the nose or gustatory receptor cells in the tongue, in the back of the mouth. Ultimately, those get converted to an electrochemical signal and a frequency of firing of action potentials through cranial nerve. These receptors are incredible in their ability to transform energy. One of the other terms you'll hear when you the term long versus short receptor. And this is just nomenclature because some receptors are very short, like in the case of hair cells and photoreceptors, they're tiny. And they have to be connected to a longer neuron that converts this voltage change in the receptor to an action potential in the neuron and travels a long distance, for example, the optic nerve, in the case of photoreceptors. So this is a short receptor because it's short and it doesn't have an axon. Long receptors, like free nerve endings in the somatosensory system, detect pain, for example, and they are directly connected. They are one with the neuron or the axon, and that might travel in a very long distance all the way up the arm and into the spinal cord, and so that's why it's called a long receptor. Okay, all senses have receptive fields. In the case of the somatosensory system or the sense of touch, the receptive field is the area of skin from which responses can be elicited in a given afferent fiber. And the receptive field sizes change based on the sensitivity of the skin. So when receptive field sizes are very small, area of skin is very sensitive to touch. In the visual system, the receptive field is the area of the visual world that a single cell, such as a retinal ganglion cells in the visual system, can detect. In the auditory system, the receptive field might be the frequency of sound that's detected. All right, so we've talked about reception. Let's talk about cortical topography. So all sensory systems are organized in the cortex in a file system, essentially. And that topography has a special name. For the sense of touch, the topography is called somatotopic organization. For vision, it's retinotopic because it corresponds to the surface area of the retina. In the sense of hearing, it's called tonotopic organization. It's organized by the tone. For the sense of taste and smell, it's a little complicated. There is organization, it's just not as clearly organized as in these other systems. And here are some links that if you want to read more about the cortical organization. But essentially what it means is the cortex is organized like a file system. We can see this in the somatosensory system where there's topographic organization. This is actually shown for the motor system in this particular image, but it's the same for the somatosensory system. But there's particular real estate or surface area of the brain that corresponds to that particular body part and is mapped onto the cortex in that way. All sensory systems have what's called hierarchical organization, and I'm going to give you an example from the visual system. So for example, if you're looking at this beautiful piece of art Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte by Georges Seurat, you can see that there's all these different things going on. And Georges Seurat used pointillism, which is individual dots, which is similar in some senses to the way the visual system analyzes a visual image in terms of little pixels of information. But if you look at this, there's an amazing diversity of things going on in this scene. There's different levels of light and light intensity. There's various colors. There's different contrast. You can detect motion or imagine motion happening, like the sailboat going across the lake. There's objects, there's faces, and there's a misconception that the eye just works like a Polaroid camera, where the image just is, plastered onto the retina, and then it just sort of gets, processed like a piece of film and just goes right into the brain. And that's actually a misconception. In fact, the visual system divides and conquers the visual image in up to 20 different channels that project to different brain regions to analyze different aspects of a visual scene to drive different behaviors. So for example, there is a channel that looks just at color, right? There's a channel that looks just at motion. There's a channel that brings that information together in the brain to look at objects and to look at faces, to analyze different levels of light. And those channels, so they dissect the information and analyze it in 20 different ways in multiple brain regions, and that information is then brought together in the cortex. So instead of it being like a Polaroid camera where the image is just plastered on the back of the head, it's really more a complex circuit. This is, for example, a publication in 2014 linked here where you can read more about this hierarchical organization. And this shows you, like for example, at the photoreceptor level, we just look at photons. We're just detecting photons. At the ganglion cells level, we start to detect contrast and different colors. At the cortex, we start to detect bars and edges and borders and texture. And then it's not until we're in, the temporal lobe and higher level cortices and the parietal lobe and association cortices that we really start to put this together as shapes and complex features such as faces. There's been some criticism to the idea of hierarchical organization, and there's a paper here if you're interested. But the common idea is that in visual systems, the information starts out very simple at the receptor level, and it gets more complex as you go to the brain. One more thing that's common to all sensory systems is adaptation, meaning that the gain on the sensory system can change. And I'm going to give you an example from the visual system. Environmental stimulus is photons, and there is an enormous range of light intensities in our environment, from 10 to the 12 photons per meter squared per second to 10 to the 22. Right? So from the dimmest night sky to the brightest sunny day on the top of a ski mountain. Now, our visual system has three main strategies. One, we just change the pupil diameter from constricted in bright light to dilated in dim light. There's also a division of labor in the visual system where there'll be a certain type of cell, in this case a rod, that detects light at dimmer intensities of light, and cones operating at brighter light environments. But finally, there's a biochemical adaptation where the photoreceptors themselves can change their gain at which they can detect light. This happens when you go from a dark movie theater into a bright, daytime, and the cones actually change their adaptation to be less sensitive to light in a bright environment. So it's not just photoreceptors that do this, but hair cells, olfactory receptor cells, many of the other receptor cells in the special senses, they all have adaptation where they're able to change the gain. When we think about this diagram of special sensory processing, where do each of these terms occur? Because when a patient comes and says, I can't see, what you really need to do is to break down what their concern is with what's really happening. If they say, I can't see, is that a problem with the sense organ? Are we talking about a problem with the photoreceptor or with the retina? Is the problem sensation, where there's a problem with the action potentials in the nerves that are traveling up the hierarchy? Or is it that the organ is working and the nerves are working, but it's actually a problem in the brain with perception or identification? Or maybe the problem is with interpretation. Big picture, is the patient struggling with sensation, with reception, sensation, or perception? We'll talk more about this in subsequent lectures.